novel Dracula was published on May 26, 1897 in London, England, and went on to inspire a vampire literary and media evolution that no one would have predicted or expected, and is still evolving 125 years later. Author Bram Stoker was born in Dublin, Ireland on November 8, 1847. As a child, he spent many years sick and confined in bed with an unknown illness and was entertained by his mother's tales of horror. In 1864, Bram Stoker attended Trinity College in Dublin while working as a journalist and theatrical critic. His first book was published in 1881, and 16 years later, in 1897, Dracula hit the shelves. Stoker wrote 18 books in total before he passed away in 1912. According to vampire scholar J. Gordon Melton, Stoker's novel has evolved to include an estimated 800 to 1,000 editions worldwide and has been published in over 40 languages. It has also influenced 43 film adaptations of Dracula to the big silver screen, the most of any single literary work. Did Stoker know he would influence and shape the entire vampire genre, and that we would be still celebrating his accomplishments 125 years later?
My name is Dacre Stoker. I'm the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, and I'm thrilled to be here in this celebration of the 125th anniversary of the publication of Dracula. If I had the opportunity to sit down and have coffee with Bram, what would I ask him? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, what was the cause of your mysterious illness for the first 7 years of your life? What was it like to be an invalid, to be confined to your room, to not have a normal life for the first 7 years of your life?
If I could sit down and have a cup of coffee with Bram Stoker, I cannot tell you how many questions I would want to ask him. I'm sure we all have a huge list. So I went through various options in my mind. I'd love to be able to ask him, did he know that newspapers in Sweden and Iceland had published adapted versions of his novel within 3 years of it being published? I'm guessing the answer is no. I'd love to ask him how much he revised Dracula between the first written draft and the published version. And I think the answer to that is quite a lot, but I'd love to know how much. I'd love to ask him what it was that particularly spoke to him in the poetry of Walt Whitman. I don't really expect him to say it's because it talked about male-male attraction, but I think he might say some interesting things about Walt Whitman's interest in nature and sense of nature as divine, which I think would be quite illuminating. But great though those questions would be to ask, I think thinking through the options, in the end, the one question I would ask him, if I only had one option, was, is his Count Dracula supposed to be any one particular historical figure? I deliberately would not mention Vlad Dracula in my question, because I wouldn't want to lead him in his answer. I would want to leave the floor open for him to talk about who his Count Dracula is. I would expect him to say that Count Dracula is not meant to be any one particular historical figure. What I think in Bram's mind Dracula is a fictional vampire drawing on an amalgam of various different historical princes from the right sort of region to give him historical colour. I'd expect him to say something like that. I'd probably ask some follow-up questions to probe into how much he did actually know about Vlad Dracula. I would ask him, how much did you know about Vlad Dracula, the historical prince, before you came across his name? In William Wilkinson's account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. One interesting question is, did he know anything about Vlad's impaling habits, or did he just see him as a sort of warrior prince? I'm sure we'd have plenty to talk about on just that one single question, and I know it's been a massive area of debate in Dracula studies, so we'd all love to know a little bit more about that.
Well, if I had a chance to meet up with Stoker and enjoy a cup of coffee with him, there are several things I would. The one that immediately pops to mind is that there's some loose ends with Dracula, and I would love to find out. For example, how did Renfield make his contact Dracula. I mean, he just shows up in the loony bin there, and but it's like he's already had contact with Dracula. Did he go to Transylvania? I don't think Dracula has ever come to England, but they seem to be on pretty close terms, and he's in tune with him. How did that happen? I would also like to explore something like the solar mace. What is the impact of Satanism and Satan in the mythology about Dracula? It's certainly there, but it's never spelled out as to exactly Satan's role behind Dracula and the like. And then I would like some of the more contemporary notions of if he had any inkling, any expectation that the novel would be as successful as it has, and his character would become known well beyond the English-speaking world, well beyond European society in North America, and would be known in places like Japan that are not English-speaking or not European-derived societies. So those are the kinds of things. I think we could have a delightful couple of hours exploring just those questions. There are obviously some more I could think of if I had time to sit around and think about it.
Actually, I did spend a long time at first thinking, would that be a coffee in 1897 or in 2021? But anyway, I kind of thought in the end that there was two of the main you just have to ask, just so you would stop all these continual arguments going on in groups online, is who did you actually base Count Dracula on? Was it one person? And then where is Castle Dracula? Where exactly is that? Just to stop all this about where it is. And is it in Ireland? But for my own little quirky bit to ask about it as well, would be just how annoyed were you when Irving said he didn't like it? That must have really annoyed you, because that would have been the real springboard to go on and do things, and your best mate just going, yeah.
I think the main question would be how on earth he found the time to do what he did. I mean, he had a full-time job at the Lyceum Theatre in London, and he was working for the most famous actor-manager in the world, Henry Irving, who had an ego to match. So that was a full-time job in itself. The job involved him in evening work almost every evening, where he would chivvy the staff, the stage staff and the actors, and usually join them for dinner afterwards. So he seldom went home. He wrote Dracula, or the notes for Dracula, on all sorts of little bits of paper, Lyceum Theatre paper, hotel bits of paper, for overnight stays. So he pieced together this extraordinary book, which holds together as a unity over a period of, as we know, about 7 years, of 1891 onwards. So how the hell did he do it? I mean, as a writer who tries to balance lots of plates myself, I'm full of admiration for this person who could hold down a full-time job, raise a family, write this book, and indeed, in between starting Dracula and finishing it, he published a couple of other books as well. So question number one, Bram, how on earth do you find the time to do it? Because it was really remarkable. And I think also to say to him, when you died, your obituaries scarcely mentioned Dracula. They mentioned the Lyceum, they mentioned Henry Irving, and so on. What a nice man Bram Stoker was. Today, they'd scarcely mention anything else because it's such a huge global cultural phenomenon. So Bram, welcome to over 100 years later, and I hope you enjoy your fame at last, because you didn't enjoy it in your lifetime.
If I could sit down with Bram Stoker, what would I ask him? There's so much I would love to ask. But I suppose as I come from a film and television background, I think my main interest in, if I could sit with him, would be to ask him who were the actors who delivered what he thinks were the best performances of Dracula as he conceived of the character. And I suppose that would be like a two-part question. Who are the actors who he thinks best created Dracula as he had envisioned the vampire, this master vampire, but also who were the actors who delivered a performance as Dracula that surprised him and brought something new and interesting to his conception of Dracula. Was there someone out there who did something that he wished he had thought of, or which seemed to come out of the novel which he had never envisioned? There have been so many amazing performances. It would be really exciting to get his perspective on how Dracula has evolved through the actors who have played him over the 100 years of adaptations.
There's a number of things I would like to ask Bram Stoker over coffee any day. This year I would probably try to make it a sort of matinee event. And I would like to show him Nosferatu and talk a little bit about that.
So if I could sit down with Bram Stoker and have a coffee and a chat, I think I'd ask him about the influence of old Irish stories and legends in his writing, and in particular Dracula, because I knew, for example, that his mother was a great storyteller, what we call in Irish as a shanachie. And the fact that she would have obviously included the folkloric and oral traditions of Irish storytelling in her telling of stories to Bram as he was a child, I really would like to know what influence that had in his writing and his Gothic legacy. I think there's a lot of the old Irish traditions and old Irish stories to be found and unpicked and unfurled in Dracula, but I'd like to know what his process was as he was writing and thinking and dreaming about those Gothic wonders that he's come up with.
So if I could sit down with Bram Stoker and have a coffee with him and a chat, of course there would be many questions I would like to ask him for admittedly very selfish reasons. Because for more than a decade I've been trying to find out about the backgrounds and the intentions of Dracula. For example, the site of the castle. Did he really have Mount Israel in mind? Or the identity of the Count? Did he introduce the other of his race on purpose to distract again from the historical Dracula that he had been describing at the start? Was he even aware of this whole paradox of fact and fiction, that adding more and more historical and geographical detail to the story would force him in the end to blur it again, so that readers could not point their finger at the story and say, oh, this is not factual, as you claim in the preface. Carfax was it described after his own visits to Oxford and his knowledge of the historical building there. Did he read the book by Emily Gerard and track her journey to the site of the Scolament at Lake Hermanstead? The church at Kingstead, was it really based on his own visits to Hendon, as suspected by Philip Temple? The foreign translations, was he aware of the Hungarian translation? Did he ever authorize the Swedish versions? Did he even write a preface for it? Or were these versions just pirated? So in just 30 minutes you could make or break a whole decade of research. And of course it wouldn't be only my own research I would be interested in, also things that other people have been trying to find out about his personal life. What was his relationship with Irving really? What did he think of him? Especially after the storage of props of the Lyceum Theatre burned out and wasn't insured due to Irving. More personal questions too, like did he continue to have sex with Florence after their son Noel had been born? Did he really attract syphilis? Was this the cause of his illness and finally of his death? Many people are interested in his life, that books have been written about it, that it has become the subject of academic research.
Well, if I had the chance to speak to Bram Stoker, I think my major question would be about the sources he relied upon, his influences for writing Dracula. The archival record is very incomplete. We've seen in the early 70s a major push to consider Vlad Tepes the major inspiration. Since that time, the pendulum's kind of swung away from Vlad the Impaler. I'd love to ask him how much Vlad influenced his work, as well as how aware he was of some of the other 19th century vampire literature, vampire theater. I have to think he was aware of Dion Boucicault's The Vampire, the play, but I don't know how familiar he was. So I would want to ask him those kinds of questions.
If I could sit down with Bram Stoker for a coffee, what would I ask him? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is about the characters from the novel. Which one of them was his favorite? If so, was it Dracula himself? The ever mysterious Van Helsing? Perhaps one of the ladies? I mean, he devoted quite a lot of space in the novel to Mina, to description of her character and building her character, interest of and fascination with science and inventions of science. So I would like to know whether this has anything to do with his special respect for Mina as a character. I would like to know if he ever knew that he was going to kill Dracula in the end. Spoiler alert. Sorry. Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about Dracula as a main and a very strong character and the title character, is not the character you would like to kill. That's what I would like to ask Bram Stoker. So did he always know that Dracula is doomed to failure in the end? Perhaps does he regret his choice? So if he was writing the book again, if he had the chance to write it again, would he go a different way? And we have so many cinematic productions, and the ending is probably the most varied from one to another. So Dracula's final days, or in some, are presented in a very few manners. So it's not even following the Bram Stoker's original always. And then there are some productions where he survives and he leads his life, or he gets back from the grave again. So if he had a chance, would he kill him the same way he did? And then this time when he did, was there ever a chance that there is going to be a happy ending for Dracula in the book? And another thing is not a question as such, but an invitation. Dear Bram, if you have any means of coming down to the 21st century, I wonder what you would make of all the fuss that is still being made about Dracula. This modern world is absolutely crowded with Dracula. You have it in books, in sequels, in stories that are citing the character, which are reviving the character. You have productions, televised productions, you have cinematic productions, you have merchandise in the shop. So every single person around probably knows who Dracula is. And every child knows who Dracula is because there are animations. So this is the whole new world that can surely blow your minds away. And if you can visit the Earth, please do.
If I was to sit down with Bram Stoker for coffee, there would be 4 things that I'd like to ask him, and all relate to rumours and speculations about his novel. The first one would be, what was the spark that inspired the novel's writing in the first place? His son, Irving Noel, for instance, I believe, said that Bram Stoker had a nightmare about a vampire after too much stuffed crab or something along those lines. But I'd want to know if there was a bit more to the story, if that was just a family rumour, or whether it was inspired by other vampire literature. What was really the foundational spark of the story? The other thing I'd want to know is how much did he know about Vlad the Impaler, aka Vlad Dracula, whose name he took for the count in the book. Until the late 70s, a lot of it was very speculative. until the discovery of Stoker's working notes, where he'd actually listed a variety of historical sources which could be cross-referenced with bits and pieces that he took from certain books. But a recent discovery in the London Library of books that Stoker had checked out while he was there suggests there could have been sources that he may not have written about, so there might be a little bit more that he knew. And for the sake of historical research, I think it would be very interesting to know just how in-depth Stoker went into Vlad's history. The third thing I'd be curious to know is what Stoker would make of modern interpretations of his book, because his story's been tackled from so many different angles. One of the more notable ones is a Freudian analysis by Maurice Richardson in 1959, where he referred to the story as, and I quote here, a kind of incestuous, necrophilious, oral and anal all-in wrestling match. I think that would have left Stoker a bit flabbergasted, but I would just love to see the expression on his face coming across these various interpretations, especially as he's considered to be a little bit of a prudish Victorian as well. And the last thing I'd want to know, there was a little rumour kind of floating around that Stoker had sort of laid the groundwork for a sequel to the novel. And if we consider, for example, the way the Count is dispatched, to give a spoiler alert from 1897 here, where instead of being staked, Dracula is impaled with a Bowie knife and his throat slit with a kukri knife, which is not the prescribed way that Van Helsing talks about in the novel. So there might be some hint that he could have intended the story to extend beyond what it was. However likely or unlikely that might be, that would be interesting. I would have loved to have had Stoker continue the story.
Since I've studied him for a little while, and I know there's like only one interview about Dracula with him, I would ask, since I write as well about vampires, I would ask him what triggered vampire. What triggered, because it really hadn't really been done. I mean, it had been maybe in some penny dreadfuls or something, but I think that I want to know like what made him just do it and motivate him to like write such a thick book about a vampire, and what motivated him to keep at it, because I know he had been working on it for a while. And was it because he was working in the theater? Was it some characters he might have run into at the theater, because you meet all sorts? What it was, what triggered that I'm going to write this. And I would also ask, were you mad about some of the stuff they left out through the editions? How did that feel? And did you want to publish that separately or just hold on to it? And I think that would be it. That would be way more than enough for me.
Okay, I've got a whole bunch of stuff that I would ask Stoker. When did you first learn about vampires? When did you decide to write a vampire novel? Were you influenced by Carmilla? Did you ever meet Le Fanu? If so, why did you choose to make Dracula a warlord? I totally understand why you chose to set parts of Dracula in London, which was the center of the civilized world. And I especially like that your novel takes us to places in London that we might recognize, including the Zoo, Highgate Cemetery, Piccadilly. What led you to set the early chapters of Dracula in Transylvania, a place you had never traveled? Someone eliminated a section at the end of the novel in which the castle is destroyed. Did you do that? Does that mean that you were considering a sequel? I've read your notes on Dracula. What were you thinking about when you kept changing the character of Quincy Morris? Some of your later novels, including Lady Athelene, which I thoroughly enjoyed and which most people today don't read, include women who might be considered new women, sexually open, striving for equality. Your treatment of women in Dracula is more complicated, and I'll be honest, horrifying. The scene in which the men butcher Lucy was completely revolting. Yet you treat Mina very differently until the end, when you seem to put her on a pedestal and deny her the voice that you've given her throughout the novel. Did something happen over the course of your life to cause you to change your ideas about women?
This may be an odd response, but I really wouldn't ask him anything about Dracula. I have no doubt he'd be surprised at the book's longevity and success. And I honestly don't care what he intended with this, that, or the other thing in the book. I have no doubt he'd be appalled at some of the critical interpretations of his work that focus on representations of, say, sex and sexuality, for example, which doesn't necessarily invalidate those interpretations. I think the thing I would be most interested in is contextualizing the novel more fully, in picking the brain of an actual Victorian about Victorian existence. Because the problem that we have as 21st century scholars is that there is no way to capture the late 19th century structure of feeling, to borrow from Raymond Williams. We can't know what it was actually like to live there, no matter how many books from the period we read and how deeply we dig into the historical archives. So talking with someone from the period, I think, would be very enlightening in that respect.
Now that you have learned what you have learned, it would be well for you to return to your own country. I prefer to remain and protect those whom you would destroy.